Hey guys, so here's kind of a funny story. So I am not a YouTube genius. I read all of chapter 6 already and thought I had done it correctly and went to download it so you guys could hear me read chapter 6 and it wasn't there. So hopefully that does not happen again. I'm going to read chapter 6 again. But what I did discover is that on the globe, I had actually been calling Singapore the wrong place. So let me just show you. Let's see if we can even have you see that. So I had been calling this big stretch Singapore. That's not, that's Sumatra. Singapore, I think, is down here. So anyway, they are now heading to Sumatra, or in Sumatra. And it's this big island. And that we find out about in chapter 6. All right, and chapter 6 has, and it's pretty exciting because now I read it. Chapter 6 has the title A Dangerous Journey. Sumatra, the sixth largest island in the world, sits on the equator. It's a land of wild jungles, raging rivers, and steep mountains. From the island's east coast, we had to travel across the entire island about 300 miles to the west coast and a ship to freedom. For now, the Dutch still held the island, but it was only a matter of time before it fell to the Japanese. So remember, the Japanese are taking over all these islands. They're coming in with bombs and airplanes to bomb things, and they're taking over this part of the country, or this part of the world. One of my favorite humans, George White, didn't sail with us. He and two other men decided to take their chances on whatever small boat they could find and sail the 2,680 miles to India across the open sea. My job, as always, was to stay with my ship's crew and keep them safe. I gave George's hand a final lick goodbye and climbed the Tong Kang's gangway. So they're taking a real small ship to try to get to India, and that's pretty dangerous because 2,680 miles is a long way to travel. When I got on board, I curled up next to Les Serli and hoped for the best. We reached the coast of Sumatra and the mouth of the powerful Indragiri River 2 days later. The Tong Kang pushed as far inland as it could before sailing became impossible. Huge animals I had never seen before roamed the thick jungle on either side of us and lounged on the riverbanks. Sumatran tigers, crocodiles, elephants, leopards, rhinos, apes, and more. The snakes, vipers, cobras, and kraits were familiar from my time on the desert island. The mosquitoes, fire ants, leeches, scorpions, and other crawling things were ones we already knew too well. So this is the rainforest. There's some scary animals there, some dangerous animals. So this is a very dangerous walk that they're making. We had to trek through the dense rainforest and the mountains by foot to a railroad. From there, we would catch a train to the port city of Padang. I took the lead on our trek, looking for a solid ground and alerting my humans to any threats that stood in our way. One of those threats included a crocodile that didn't slip back into the river when we neared. I growled at it, warning it to get away, but I accidentally got a little too close. Ouch! I danced back just in time to escape its giant jaws, but it managed to slash my shoulder with its claws before it escaped into the river. From then on, I was careful to keep my distance while I barked warnings at the beasts, but there was no way I was going to let a crocodile ambush my humans. Once I even had to scare away a hungry tiger. So it's a good thing that they have Judy along on this trip because she protects them. For most of our trek, we had to walk single file under relentless rain, carrying the wounded on stretchers that they made of tree branches. We ate what we could find, and I supplied what I could catch, mostly snakes and flying foxes. It took 3 weeks, but we finally made our way to Sawaluento and its train station on March 15th. Rumor had it that the Japanese army was rapidly advancing, so we lost no time hopping a train for the final 50 miles to Padang and freedom. There were cries of, "There's the sea," as the train reached the top of a hill over Padang on the morning of March 16th. But an old man met us at the station with terrible news. The last ship left. You just missed it, which is very sad for them. A minute before, I could smell hope, and now I smelled only despair. I padded from human to human, trying to raise their spirits, but it was nearly impossible. The Dutch still controlled the city, but just barely. Surrender to the Japanese had already been arranged. So now it looks like the Japanese are taking over this island. We spent the night on the docks, hoping that the Dutch were wrong and another boat would come to our rescue. None did. The next day, the men were ordered to give up any weapons they had and take shelter in a school to wait for the Japanese. I heard them and smelled them before the others, motorcycles and trucks outside, and then boots pounding through the school. Sara Lee made a leash from the cloth of his torn pants and slipped it around my collar. Japanese soldiers marched in, shouting words no one understood, with swords jangling at their sides. One of them pointed at me, yelled something, and swept out of the room, and the others followed him. A low growl rose in my throat. Kickers. But Sara Lee shushed me. Are they going to kill us all, I wondered? But they had other plans for us. On March 17th, 1942, the Japanese made us prisoners of war. We wouldn't be executed for now. Executed means that they weren't going to kill them. The next day, the Japanese separated the men and me from the women and children and sent them to a different camp. Then the men were marched to the Dutch Army barracks. I joined the British, Australian, and Dutch sailors, soldiers, and airmen as we trudged across town. Japanese guards rushed us along, prodding the men with their rifles. My men were exhausted, dirty, hungry, embarrassed, and defeated. I raised my head and wagged my tail, marching alongside them. Let's show them we're not broken, I wanted to say. Slowly, the men around me understood. Heads rose, spines straightened, and steps quickened. Even the wounded showed their pride. We would need that strength and pride to survive. It was a struggle just to stay alive on the food rations provided by the Japanese. Sara Lee had done his best to show the enemy that I was a full member of the Royal Navy, but there were no rations for me. I was hungry all the time. It was the same desperate hunger I had felt in my early days alone in Shanghai. Sara Lee and his buddies gave me what they could spare, but even they sometimes scrounged through our guards' trash, searching for something to eat. So I learned to hunt for my own food. Lizards, snakes, rats, and whatever rice the men could spare made up my diet. I shared what I caught with my men. Still, we never had enough. The days were filled with boredom and hunger and boredom. Weeks went by, and word came that we were being moved to Belawan, a port city in Sumatra. A long caravan of trucks arrived. I wasn't welcomed by the Japanese, so Sara Lee and his buddies had to sneak me on board and hid me under some rice sacks for the hot 5-day journey across the island. When we reached Belawan, I smelled fear. No one had told the men what would happen next. Would we sail for Japan? I had worries of my own. Will Sara Lee be able to sneak me on board a ship, or will I be left behind to fend for myself? Shortly after we arrived in Belawan, our Japanese colonel stood on a box and spoke to the men for the first time. I am your father and you are my children, Colonel Bano said. You must obey me, or I will cut off your heads. He waited a moment to let that sink in. I hope you will be happy in my camp. My fondest hope is that you will all go home after Japan has won the war. He didn't tell the men where that camp was or what would happen to them when they got there. I hid out as best I could around the docks while the men waited in dark, one-room huts to discover their fate. It didn't take long. Instead of boarding a ship, they were forced into rail cars with no windows, light, or air. So they were in the train cars that are usually used for supplies. Once again, I slipped in unnoticed with Sara Lee and his buddies. Luckily, the trip was short. On June 27, 1942, we entered a camp in Glogauer, a suburb of the Sumatran city of Medan. We found ourselves crowded into what had been Dutch army barracks, even more crowded than those in Padang. Rations were less than they had been. A cup of watery rice in the morning and some kind of boiled flour for dinner. Ugh. The men had nothing to spare for me, so once again I took up hunting. The guards were angry and mean. They kicked and threw stones when they saw me. I hated them, and they knew it, but I was still faster than their boots. After many days locked up in the barracks, the men were finally allowed outside and put to work. Some worked on building an airfield so the Japanese planes could land. So they have them working, and they're working to help the other side of the war. So they are working for the enemy right now, which is hard for people. Others cleared the jungle to build a Japanese temple. Work was often accompanied by brutal beatings if the men didn't move fast enough. I made new friends while I was slinking around camp and traveling to the work sites to protect my men from snakes. One of my new friend's cobbler cousins was a man who made and repaired boots for the Japanese soldiers. He used to slip me small pieces of leather. They were hard to chew and even harder to digest, but at least it was something. Months passed, and with each one, it seemed our food rations got smaller and smaller. The men were desperate, and sometimes that meant they did foolish things, because when you're really hungry, you'll do what you can to eat. One day, cousins talked Sarah Lee into helping him steal a sack of rice that was unguarded. They hid it under a blanket in the back of the barracks. The next day, 2 guards marched into the barracks. And barracks, in case you didn't know, was where you stayed, where you slept. Shouting and demanding to inspect everything. The men got more and more desperate as the guards moved through the barracks. My friend's cousins and Sarah Lee were especially scared. If the Japanese discovered that rice, they would be beaten to death. I have to do something. We had all noticed that the Japanese were terrified of death. Human skeletons and graves especially made them jumpy. They frightened them. I dashed to a graveyard where the local Sumatrans buried their dead and looked for an old grave. This was very clever for Judy to do. I silently apologized to the skeleton I uncovered, and then I raced back to the barracks. You should have seen the kickers' faces when I ran in with a human skull between my teeth. They screamed and yelled while I made 3 loops around the room. Then, just as they were about to raise their rifles, I dropped the skull and dashed out of the room. The guards scurried out behind me, too afraid to finish their inspection. So she scared them with the skull, and they didn't find the rice. Ha! Not only did I scare the guards, my men got to keep their rice and their lives. Sadly, the extra rice didn't come in time to help my cobbler friend cousins. Soon after that, he got sick and was carried to the hospital hut. I knew that men who went in there hardly ever came out alive. I waited and waited, but my friend was gone. Sarah Lee did his best to cheer me up, but I was very sad. I miss my friend. I didn't know it then, but I was about to make a new friend, one who would turn out to be my best friend for the rest of my life. So it sounds like in Chapter 7, we're going to meet that new friend. I hope you guys are doing well at home and enjoying your story and keeping up with your chapters. And I will read Chapter 7 to you shortly. Bye, guys.